Safe Harbor Conversations, engaging heart, mind, and soul. Today we talk about faith, theology, and climate change. Our conversationalists are Eugenia Gamble, pastor, author, lecturer; Garrett Andrew, pastor and author; Farrand, a life coach, pastor, and social media shepherd; and I'm Tom Cochrun, writer, journalist, analyst, and a Presbyterian elder. And we are pleased that you are along as well. So let's frame this discussion. Climate change is not a new topic, but it has never been more prevalent. Consider these comments made in the last couple of weeks. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres: "The era of global warming has ended. The era of global boiling has arrived." He says the air is unbreathable, the heat is unbearable, and the level of fossil fuel profits and climate inaction is unacceptable. Leaders must lead. Dr. Rita Nakashima is the McClendon Scholar in Residence at New York Avenue Presbyterian Church in Washington this summer, where they're doing seminars and symposia. She said that moral injury and climate change are held in the same sentence. People despair about their future. She asked, how do we have a theology that will deeply love the earth? Professor Greg Cootsona of Chico State is also a part of a group called Science for the Church. And he wrote this summer, students have a sense of hopelessness. They sense we are teetering on the brink. We face problems that we can't fix, and we're not up to the task. We live in hopeless times. And so as people of faith, we feel we have an obligation to also approach this topic with all good faith, and we're glad that you are here with us today. So just to start this conversation, what are the implications of climate change to faith, how we preach, how we teach, and to the underpinning theology? Eugenia, you're our first time on the podcast, so you get to open.
Well, I think the implications obviously are enormous. But what fascinates me about that question is how it is we are called to articulate a theology of hope in the midst of realities, many of which are beyond our particular control. You know, I think that our theology and our pastoral way of being with these things, I think we've got the tools that we need if we will view them through the lens of this moment, the lens of the time in which we live. The time in which we live is no surprise to God. So we have the tools that we need. I think two of them, I think, are really important. One is that as pastors and leaders in churches, we have to find a way to call people to action that is personal and compelling and moral, while not falling over the edge into tribalism or partisanship. There is a call in this time to be who we most deeply are. I think, there's so many biblical places that we could dive in here. I think about the Ten Commandments. I just got through writing a book about that. And particularly, I think about the eighth commandment. We talk about that as don't steal. But what that really says, what the community has understood that to say, is that we may not take from people that which makes a life of dignity possible. So if we think about the actions that we take, if we think about the words that we preach as helping people see with that lens, then I think that gives us a place to start. I also think of Micah 6. When we teach ourselves how to do justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with God, then we come up with an ethic for moving our way through these times.
Garrett, are we prepared for the challenge of pastoring and preaching hope? I mean, do you feel that our young seminarians are getting it? Have we gotten it, particularly when cataclysm seems to be stalking us?
On Sunday at the church here in Nipomo, we had a young woman who came to preach for us. She's doing an internship at Creation Justice Ministries that used to be a part of the National Council of Churches. And part of her internship is happening in Fresno. And a friend of mine from seminary is the executive director of the Creation Justice Ministries, and was wondering if anyone would let a 23-year-old seminary student preach in their churches. And this young woman came, Ashton Adams, and she spoke directly of these things as one who is of that generation that is feeling that kind of sense of hopelessness more than maybe some older generations. Because for those younger generations, and again, my ADD brain will skip it all over, so I apologize. But there was a study that I read of that was out of Britain from about 2 years ago, where they found out that 60% of young people in 10 industrialized nations do not believe that older generations care about them. And 40% of those same young people will not have children because they're afraid of the world their children will be born into. So that sense of hopelessness is right on. And in so much of our churches, in the way Christianity has been, in my opinion, has kind of moved us away from thinking of the full of creation. And so it almost becomes a theological challenge in the midst of climate change, a preaching challenge, a teaching challenge, a faith challenge, to again find the mandate of human stewardship over creation that begins in Genesis 1:26 through 28, reflecting on our responsibility to care for the earth. And I'm more progressive in my theological orientation, and this aligns with that emphasis on the interconnectedness and the teaching that values all life forms. And it almost becomes that kind of place where when we take Matthew 25, that third parable that so many of us love, where Jesus equates himself with those in need, the thirsty, the hungry, the naked, the prisoner, the stranger, the sick, then to recognize too, again, that this very earth, this creation is a part of that identification that Jesus has. So embracing this mandate of recognizing that we are stewards of creation, we need to begin infusing our preaching and teachings with messages of environmental stewardship. And this 23-year-old did it. She was awesome. Was it a fantastic sermon? No, she'll get better at those pieces as she goes on. But it was a very good kind of piece of using Jacob wrestling with God to talk about how we need to wrestle and figure all of these pieces out, and expect that as we wrestle with God, we are going to come away limping, that our institutions are going to come away limping, that we are going to have a transformation of what our own understanding is about what the church is supposed to be in this. Almost like, if I want to keep going with Bible things, and Eugenia did a fantastic job of that, so I can't help myself. Like even with the parable of the Good Samaritan, that illustrates the call to extend love and care to our neighbors that transcends boundaries. And just as the Samaritan was called to care for the wounded traveler, we are called to extend our care to the wounded earth. And we need to begin recognizing that the earth is wounded and that we have done that. And I know that it creates partisan divide. And that's a struggle as well, because how do you bring people together? And I could feel some people in church on Sunday almost feel kind of like disquieted, like they're like, oh, this is not the kind of sermon we were expecting. But it moves to that. And I'm more mystical in my nature as well. And so this analogy of our roles as stewards, reminding us to tend the wounds of our planet, kind of just works for me. And it reminds me a little bit of Thomas Merton offering insights to the mystical connection between nature and the divine. Merton's quote, I'm going to see if I get it right, something like, every moment in every event of every man's life on earth plants something in his soul. So this kind of need of reminding that every moment of our lives on this earth does plant something in our soul, that we're not isolated beings, that we are connected to everything. And his quote to me emphasizes the spiritual significance of our interactions with the natural world. And I think that's kind of this moment. We have divorced ourselves in so many ways due to the industrial age that has caused so much of this climate change from the nature that's all around us. It's almost as if we need to kind of get back to that idea of, I mean, how many of Jesus' parables are about farms and soil, and pay attention to the wildflowers in the fields, and he sees birds and talks about foxes, and we it's so natural. We almost have to kind of go back to this sense of things, in this mystical perspective that encourages us to view environmental care not just as our duty, but as a transformative spiritual practice. I think that's, I'm done talking for now.
We're going to come back to you. Wink, sort of your opening impressions of where we are on all of this.
There is a passage in Genesis about God saying, have dominion. This would fall really into Eugenia's bailiwick, because she's good with Hebrew words. And the way we have used that has been almost an aggressive takeover of the planet. And I don't believe that's what it was meant to be. I do know that young people feel very, very lost right now. And I do know they feel very, very threatened. Otherwise, they wouldn't be gluing their hands to the concrete, and gluing their hands to artwork and other things. I would like to hear both Eugenia and Garrett talk a little bit about what is dominion of the planet. And Garrett used stewardship as one of the words. I think it goes even further than that. And I would ask that of Eugenia, if she would kind of give us an understanding of what, when we were instructed to have dominion, what exactly does that mean? So if you would do that for us, Eugenia.
Well, it's a fascinating concept, and I think it lies behind a lot of the problems that we're in, a misuse of it. The word that's used is the word for to take whole-bodied responsibility for the good of. And what we have tended to do theologically is to take that word and use it as if it means that we can just take what we want from for our own aggrandizement, that it is ours to use and to use up. And that is not at all the biblical concept. And even John Calvin later, much later in the Reformation years, John Calvin understood this, and he talked with the Genevan congregation about what dominion is not. And he went so far as to tell them that there were only two things that they needed in order to learn about God and their role in life. One, he said, obviously was the scriptures. And the other, he said, was the theater of the creatures. And he urged his congregants to not build houses of wood, to not cut down trees, to go on prayer walks with the bees, and to be, and to begin to understand what it means for us to have been given responsibility for the earth. And it was beautiful the way that he talked about this stuff, but people really don't focus on that, even in the Reformed tradition very much. That sense of the misuse of dominion as a fundamental sin, as pride on steroids, as I call it, ego on steroids, when we want what we want when we want it. and we don't think ahead at all. I remember my dad sitting here in this house saying to me when I was a little girl growing up, he said, Jeannie, always think 3 consequences ahead of your actions.
Uh-huh.
Always think 3 consequences ahead of your mouth, he said to me. And those are things that I think we have gotten lost a bit in our kind of conquest mentality that has, morphed into a conquest theology.
Well, we have the capacity to get into nuance and to claiming words and interpretation and find ourselves in some difficult situations. Garrett, I want you to respond to that. And I want to throw in this idea as well that I'd like to approach today is that have we so anthropomorphically cast God that this also now becomes a time that's a bit of a challenge because this is my Father's world. We learn that when we're very young. And this idea of we do have dominion. So if you wish to get to it, this whole business of the anthropomorphizing and how we're fighting through that.
And Tom, those are big questions. I amen everything Eugenia just said. I mean, like, dominion has been wildly misconstrued as something, again, that we should probably come up with a better word in the English, since we think of domain and that we get to dominate. And I mean, and Wink's probably right. Stewardship's not the right word. It's almost like tender, loving care, even though the root of stewardship still has this idea of taking care of your Lord's place upon the Lord's absence. And we're not doing any of that. Again, we want what we want. We have a sense of being disconnected from others. And I'll just say this piece too. When Jesus says, love your neighbor as you love yourself, perhaps he meant looking at your neighbor and seeing yourself. What would it be like to look at our creation? And where I'm sitting right now in this sanctuary, I get to see beauty all around me. So I'm just looking at it. And St. Francis of Assisi would refer to things as, brothers and sisters, the pieces of creation. What's it like to see myself in the tree there? What's it like to see myself in the stones? And all this language is in the Bible. So if people think I'm crazy, perhaps I am, but then deal with the Bible as well. Anthropomorphism and God, along with earth eschatology, or in the midst of all of those things. Anthropomorphism, God, it's how many of us have a tendency of thinking of God as like the Father with some white guy with a long white beard sitting in the clouds somewhere looking down at it all. And so much of the language does that because it gives us an ability to understand the divine that is necessarily beyond our comprehension. My children asked me one time, like, what's the deal with like the fear of God? Like, you talk about that sometimes, but are we supposed to be afraid of God? And I described to them, I think, in one time, I was like, well, what happens when we go to the beach and you sit out in the sun and then like we get burned? And I'm like, have you realized that maybe you should be afraid of sitting in the sun? Yeah, maybe. And I'm like, well, but it gives all the energy and life to this planet, that burning ball of fire in the sky that we circle around. And yet I have a healthy fear of it, kind of things. And sometimes I think we need to almost bring back kind of a sense of awe, which the word awe comes from Old English that literally means fear. From it, we get the root of both awesome and awful, because things that are full of awe bring some kind of fear. And so much of Christianity has made people afraid of God, afraid of going to hell, and turned salvation into some kind of get out of hell free card and I'm into heaven, that we've totally neglected and forgotten the sense of what it might mean to fear the divine, which we're participating in something that we cannot at all comprehend. It's terrifying. And then to speak of the humility of Christ in the midst of all of that, to almost think of that Christ hymn in Philippians 2:5-11, which introduces the concept of kenosis, the self-emptying of Christ, and then even play with this theological principle that invites us to consider the mystery of God's interaction with creation. As soon as we begin actually taking any of that seriously, it moves us beyond the anthropomorphism that we play up with. And by reflecting on the humility of the incarnation, I think we can begin to explore a theology that acknowledges the limitations of human language and fully grasp the divine in a way that allows us to know that our language, we use language to try to do it, but I'll use the Buddha, who speaks of his teachings when people are like, "Don't look at me as mighty, I'm just a finger pointing to the moon. Stop looking at my finger and calling it the moon." We need to let God be bigger, and I think maybe the easiest way to do that is to just go to Exodus maybe and look at the burning bush with Moses. Here's this vivid illustration of this God that is beyond our sensibilities, that is just pure transcendence. As Moses stands on holy ground before the unconsumed fire, and we're reminded of the profound mystery of the divine presence. And again, if we think we have God figured out, if we think we have the earth figured out, we begin to use things to get what we want instead of to recognize that we are playing in this mystery, this kenosis that is God, how everything gets to kind of be together. And I love too, if you get to the end of the Bible and you have Revelation 21 and you see this vision of a new Jerusalem symbolizing a renewed creation and God indwelling among humanity, this cosmic imagery points to a future where the boundaries between heaven and earth are transcended. By weaving this imagery into our theological discussions now, we can inspire a sense of hope and purpose that extends beyond our immediate concerns of what we think of God and how God might be playing at it. But even as I talk about it, Tom, I know that what I'm saying doesn't make all that much sense because we're so used to using languages like "I'm in the arms of God," to consider that God's arms are bigger than we can possibly imagine, holding on to everything, cares about everything. We almost have to remove that language, but it becomes hard.
Well, we cannot fathom the greatness and the expanse and the intellect and the imagination of the divine. And so we have to try to make it fit so that we can get our minds around it. I assume that all of us here probably feel that faith and science are basically partners as we advance as species on this planet. You mentioned the eschatology of the earth. Are we at a point where we now may be forced to deal with the eschatology of the earth as keepers of the faith and teachers of the word? Science tells us that ball of fire that we go around, Garrett, is eventually going to expand, and it will make life on this planet impossible. It doesn't mean that human life necessarily will not exist, but that then opens an entirely different discussion about why and how that would occur. But it also is a scientific principle. I'm not saying it's a fact, but it's a principle. And we are at a time now where people are wondering, is this earth going to be sustainable? So
not like we're doing it.
Yeah, well, and how do we bring our theology to a larger scale? Because all of this that we see, we were talking Sunday about everything we're learning from the web now is causing us to recalculate some of our principles of understanding. So, but all of that is part of creation. All of that is the work of the Creator. Is it time to start, maybe moving from junior varsity to the varsity in terms of the scope and the size of what we think of God's creation?
So Eugenia brought up Micah 6:8. Micah 6:8 is like my favorite. Like Old Testament, New Testament, it's my favorite. I love it. It's the whole of the message in one thing. And I remember talking about it years ago when I was doing a Bible study when I was still in Georgia and a very young man. I know people call me young still, but I can look at my hair and it doesn't seem as young as it used to be. And I mentioned in a Bible study one time a fellow by the name of James Stewart, who was a preacher in Scotland and by many accounts of people, the best preacher of the 20th century. And I've read his sermons, I liked it. And afterward, this fellow came up to me and said, you know, and he was an old retired minister. He's like, when I studied in Edinburgh, James Stewart was my preaching professor. And I was like, oh, wow. He's like, and you also brought up Micah 6:8. And do you know what James Stewart said about Micah 6:8? And I was like, no, I don't have a clue what James Stewart said about Micah 6:8. He's like, it can only be done in reverse. In order to truly love kindness or love mercy, you have to walk humbly with God. Mm-hmm. And in order to do justice, you need to be able to love kindness or mercy. But again, it all starts with this walking humbly with God. And currently, in our theological sensibilities or whatever, it doesn't give us much room for humility because we're looking for certainty. Churches are screaming about how, oh, the earth will be fine and God's got all of this, or it's not, or this is what dominion means, or whatever things. It's just not ripe with humility. And as soon as we humbly walk with God, it goes back to that anthropomorphism, we don't get to understand it. And yet then when we realize that, and in the midst of all of this, we are lovingly and kindly cared for. I get to exist. I get to see for however long, I don't know. I get to see your faces and they make me very happy. I get to breathe. What a joy. And I appreciate the ancient rabbis who used to say too that even our in and out breath is the divine name. Yeah, what a beautiful kind of concept that connects me to everything. But this all takes humility. And so whatever my theological notions are, whatever is important to me about what I think God is, sometimes I have to let go. And when I let go, then I get to recognize that everybody else has their own understanding, including kind of like the earth gets to be its way. But now I've moved to, I'm no longer focused on myself because I'm humbly walking with the divine. And my loving kindness now gets to be universal. And there's something that, again, Buddhists have taught us. One of the best joys of living in the 21st century is that we get to have a water cooler that is a much larger, like the water cooler conversations encompass the whole world. I get to have conversations with Buddhists. I get to have conversations with Hindus. I get to have conversations with Sufis. And in the midst of all of this, I'm not trying to say, I'm right, you're wrong. I get to learn more about the divine from all of them and still be a Christian. But there's a beautiful thing that most Buddhists do in their meditation times. They start off their meditation with an intention that their practice be for the benefit of sentient beings everywhere. And that humility has inspired me a little bit to begin. I talk to plants and animals like a little, and I freak some people out when like I'm going along and suddenly I see like a bug going across and I'm like, oh, hey, little guy, how you doing? Let's not step on him. And people are like, why are you talking to that? And I'm like, because it's glorious. But the moment you begin having these kinds of things and understand, I read years ago, and I don't even remember who put it, that when a sparrow falls out of a tree and dies, the first one to cry is God. Mm-hmm. And I was just like, oh, that kind of loving care. Now, if I begin to have that kind of loving care, when I talk about doing justice, well, how do I do justice? And I didn't know anything about John Calvin, like not cutting down trees. I think that's brilliant. And like, great. As soon as I say that, I won't probably give you any credit either, Eugenia, but I'll pretend. Anyway.
Let's give Eugenia a chance to jump in. Respond to all of that or any of it. And also this idea of the eschatology of earth. Are we there? Is this something we need to be very deliberate about, thinking about? How do we preach and teach?
Well, you know, I could have just sat here all afternoon and listened to Garrett talk about just that mystical way of expanding our hearts and minds. And I think that the Holy Spirit gives us a wonderful place to kind of get into that space. But to get to the eschatology piece, I don't know, obviously, if we are coming to the end of the life of this planet. That is above my pay grade to know that. What I do know, though, a couple of things, is that we are accompanied in all of this where we are, for I am persuaded that we are accompanied in all of this. And I think one of the things that in looking at these questions that you said ahead of time, I started thinking about a real disservice that I think that I have done with my churches for the last 40 years. And that is that many of us, I think, maybe not just me, but maybe just me, have not talked in a cogent and pastoral and hopeful way about last things, period. Whether we're talking about the last things of the planet as we know it, or whether we're talking about last things in meeting our own death, last things as we say goodbye to loved ones, last things as we watch portions of the earth become uninhabitable. You know, how do we talk about last things as people who believe that the end is never the end? And I think those conversations about last things, sometimes you even use the word eschatology with people, and all of a sudden, all they can do is just start scanning the heavens for 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, and they cannot talk about the fact that indeed we are cyclical creatures, and we live and we die to rise. We pick up our cross and we follow. And so we are following a God who is bigger than we can imagine, but who has also shown us that death is not the end. So where I think we have to be careful in thinking about all of those kinds of things, helping people understand dying to rise, whether we're talking about death or endings of a relationship or of, you know, a beach house or whatever, you know, when we're talking about that, we are always talking about that from the point of view of eternity. You know, we all have the same amount of time left. Every creature has the same amount of time left, just not here. So there's just this whole understanding of things rising and passing away that we already know something about. We have to get to a point where we can hold that in one hand, it seems to me, and also hold our compassion for those who are going to suffer most the first. And I don't think we can lose sight of either one of those poles. You know, God set the creation up as God set the creation up. We have, as I like to say, and y'all might have to bleep this out, but we have crapped in our nest. And so, you know, we have got to think about our role in creation care as both justice and compassion, while we at the same time acknowledge that there are things that end. I feel so much hope because, you know, when during the worst of pandemic lockdown, I remember seeing people from across the global community, I have friends all over the world, talking about how the canals cleared in Venice and how there were, you know, people heard birds singing in Chinese cities where they had not heard birds sing in forever. So I do think we have responsibility to do what we can to mitigate the worst outcomes for the sake of compassion for creation and for the people in it. I believe that it's got to be a both and thing.
When you've been sitting there taking all this in, I would like for you to punctuate this, and then prepare us to listen to, because you're a musician as well, a hymn response to all of this that was written by a Presbyterian pastor, Carolyn Winfrey Gillette. But your thoughts first.
Okay. My dad, his favorite subject to teach, and he spent most of his life studying it, was eschatology. And in the process, he wrote many books that were published and became textbooks for his students. And his teaching on eschatology included the parables of Jesus, and there are several, where a master entrusts his people with a certain amount of either talent or resource. He says, I'm going away, I'm going to give you this, I'm going to give you this, I'm going to give you this, and when I come back, we're going to take a look at it. And you know how the parable goes. He comes back to the one who has taken care and even helped the resource to expand. He rewards. The one that's done nothing has even buried, and the word there is talent. He's very stern with. There's a reprimand. Now, when I look at the word eschatology, I'm always thinking of the return of Jesus because of growing up with my dad talking about it so much. When Jesus comes back, what's he going to find? How have we taken care of this resource that is all around us? What have we done to expand it in kind and loving ways, or what have we done to diminish it? And this is where the young people are. They have a definite feeling that we're in the process of diminishing ourselves into annihilation. And when I was a youth pastor, I remember one of the young people came to me and they said, we've got a problem, blah, blah, blah. And I gave this long theological answer. And they sat and patiently listened to me give the long and theological answer, which, was my way of doing a duck and cover and trying to talk my way out of having to do something. And the young person said to me, yes, that's all fine and good. What are we going to do about it? In their practical thinking, because that's the way they think. What are we going to do about it? I do believe Jesus is going to come back, and I do believe we will give an account, for how we took care of things here. A lot of times we over spiritualize that, I think, but I think a lot of what that means is, what did we do with the planet? And so, yes, this young man that sings this song is a worship leader at the Presbyterian Church. I don't know his name, but he's done several of these types of reframing of an old hymn tune. And this, I think, is especially clever. When I've had to compose, there is an artistry to taking words and putting them to the music in the right place to give the most impact. There's a real artistry. They've done well with this. And Tom, I think you knew that it was a Presbyterian. Was it a pastor's wife or?
Carolyn Winfrey Gillette. She is a pastor, and so is her husband. And she has written hymns previously for the Presbyterian Church. And this just seems to speak to where we are right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, let me play this, and then we can respond to it.
The climate is changing, creation cries out. Your people face flooding, fire and drought. We see the great heat waves and storms at their worst. We pray for the poor, Lord, for they suffer first. We pray for the animals here in our midst, who cannot cannot defend their own right to exist. We pray for the mountains, forests, and seas that bear the harsh footprints of our human greed. We thank you for people who treasure the earth, whose faith has long taught them its beauty and worth. We thank you as well for the children and you who look to the future and speak out the truth. We thank you for leaders courageous and brave, who know that the earth is worth fighting to save, who care about justice and what they should do, who listen to science and work hard for you. You love this good earth, and you sent us your Son. May we love our neighbors, there's work to be done. May we, by your Spirit, do all in our power to care for your earth in this critical hour. May we, by your Spirit, do all in our power.
I like that those words are hung on a frame that also had the words immortal, invisible, God only wise. And I think those of us who have been around a Presbyterian church for a decade or two probably can't help but feel that sort of channeling through. But I want to take those very moving words, and before you all respond to them, I just want to add again what the Secretary General of the United Nations said. The level of fossil fuel profits in climate inaction is unacceptable. Leaders must lead. Garrett?
I can't make anybody lead. And like, that's the sense of hopelessness that I know a lot of the young folk are feeling. And I'm barely a millennial, right on the edge between millennial and X. And I have been told this my whole life. And I haven't seen anything happen in terms of leadership until very recently. And actually, there's good news coming out of the Inflation Reducement Act that really got a lot of climate change things in from out of Washington. They're losing more money than they thought. We're actually going to increase the national debt in all sorts of ways from this act, but it has everything to do with the amount of companies that are getting tax rebates due to doing more green energy things. And so it might be something, and strangely, in the article that I read, the United States, by doing that and having so much be done here at home, is now pressuring other industrialized nations to begin up-ramping their own green energy kind of movements, so that the United States isn't the like foremost one of all of those things. There's even good news coming out of China with regards to some of that. So when I say a sense of a lack of hope, yeah, the lack of hope is the world's burning now. Like, we're there. There's people talking about the collapse of the Atlantic current happening far sooner than was expected, which would cause God knows what kind of things. We have no idea. But I can't change leaders, and the ways too that we've been told with the minor changes that we make, we'll be able to do something. Of course, it's fairly nonsensical, and most young people know that. Like, we can do whatever recycling things, put solar onto our things, make sure that we compost, whatever else. But it's such an infinite piece in a greed-filled industrial complex of corporate kind of like, let's grab as much as we can, that it's to speak of it theologically, it's part still of the human piece of sin, and And it's happening. And yeah, the poor people are going to suffer first, as Eugenia said earlier, and is said in the song. That's always what happens. And that's tragic and terrible, and it's already happening. What happened in Pakistan with the floods they had about a year and a half ago? How many people were affected by that? What's going on in India? Just those kinds of pieces. The warmest winter ever in South America. The ice sheets in Antarctica being the least they've ever been. Like, all of this is terrible, and it sounds impossible. And so I'll take the little glimmers of hope that I've heard only in the last week, that it sounds like maybe our leaders are finally starting to do something, because that is the only chance that we have. And yet it necessitates for all of us to recognize that the way that we've experienced our lives, especially us Americans, I look at our lily white faces right here, the four of us, like we are the epitome of the top of the trash heap that is this world. We have to have a brand new way of experiencing life that means that our sense of endless kind of gathering and becoming more and getting more goes away. And the younger generations are finally starting to understand that, but that also provides a sense of hopelessness in their own experience of things, that they don't get to have everything is comfortable, because we were always taught that we were going to keep having more and more. So there's this dual hopelessness. But the one that we have to like live into is the one that isn't real anyway. And that's our need to have all this comfort and greed and stuff that we've ever wanted. We don't need it. And you know, like, while billionaires want to shoot themselves to Mars in an effort to save humanity, it's like William Shatner when he saw space for what it was, and he immediately recognized that this little green and blue ball that we're spinning on is our only home, and we don't get to exist anywhere else.
Eugenia, you're from your own family's history and from the history of your ministry. You have been on the front line of racial equity and social justice issues, and yet I don't think you've lost hope. It seems hopeless at times when you look at how we move backwards, but you seem to still channel hope.
I do. I still feel hopeful, and maybe that's because I'm 70 and I'm not going to have to, live on this planet for that much longer. I don't know, but I don't think so. I mean, I still believe that I still believe that nevertheless, the best is always in front of us. And, even if that means that, we have to change our expectations, those of us of privilege have to change our expectations of excess, our expectations of what we want, and learn what it is we really need. I believe that will be good for us if we do it. Now, I agree with Garrett. How you get greed to see differently, that's above my pay grade. I mean, that's going to take a work of God, in order to make that happen. But I do feel hopeful, and one of the questions that you asked us to think about was, how do we talk about these things with children? And I started wondering if maybe, we should think about that a different way, and think about, thanks, baby, and think about what they can teach us as much as what we can teach them, because children have an innate sense, until we beat it out of them some way or another, they have an innate sense of what is important and what is sacred. Our grandchildren were here a couple of weeks ago, and it was the first time we'd seen them since we left California in 2019, and they're now 5 and 7. And what was so wonderful to me was to watch them blossom as we tried to nourish their imagination and their creativity. I mean, we were making banquets for fairies who lived in gladiola blossoms. And now, you know, they are thinking about creation. They are thinking about the magic of life and of this world, and in ways that, you know, I planted one tiny seed and there's a forest now in those two little girls. And to me, that gives me hope. They will be better than we ever dreamed to be. They will and here's the other thing, and here's the last thing I have to say. Here's the other thing. Those of us who have, you know, made some trips around the sun already, we know what it is like to gird up our loins and face challenges. We've done it before. I remember back in 100 years ago during the Rodney King riots, and I was pastoring in Denver then, and I was sitting on my sofa and I dissolved into tears after everything my family went through in the civil rights movement. I dissolved into tears and I called my folks and I said, "Mama, I don't think I can do this again." And she said, "Jeannie, you may have to." And so that's the thing. Every generation has its battle to fight for love and compassion and justice. And we will continue to do what we can until our last breath, and maybe beyond, for all I know. And so will those who come after us. My prayer is that in this moment, we will wake up to the opportunity, to the reality that we were made for a moment such as this, and we will do our part so that in the great cloud of witnesses has given us the, you know, the wave when we finished our race, we can know that we did the best that we could, that we didn't give up, that we didn't sink into the mire of despair, that we faced hardship, and that we did that with the sacred knowing of, nevertheless, no matter what we have to take on, we are not doing it unaccompanied, and we are not doing it without power.
Mm-hmm.
Those of you who are teaching elders, preachers, you guide us, you counsel us, and you have to make decisions about how you respond to us and to what you are preaching about. I'm going to read a line from Gilead, which is a book that I reread during the winter for some reason. And this line, I just would like for you pastors to respond to this. It was like a war, really. One funeral after another right here in Iowa. We lost so many of the young people, and we got off pretty lightly. People came to church wearing masks if they came at all. They'd sit far from each other as they could. There was talk that maybe the Germans had caused it with some sort of secret weapon. And I think people wanted to believe that because it saved them from reflecting on what other meaning it might have. The parents of these young soldiers would come to me and ask me how the Lord could allow such a thing to happen. I felt like asking them what the Lord would have to do to tell us he didn't allow something.
I'm a Christian who claims to say that God became incarnate and died on a cross. There's a certain absurdity as to allows. It is what it is. I mean, I don't remember which Niebuhr. Maybe one of you will. Which was it? H. Richard or Reinhold who said anything worth doing won't be completed in our lifetime.
I don't remember which.
One of them. So the Niebuhr brothers. But like, and there's that truth. And I do have hope as well. I mean, the young people who talk of feeling hopeless actually give me hope because they're paying attention to the reality of it. They're not trying to walk in the same line. Like they feel hopeless because they're like, oh, like, but when I felt like turning 21 was really kind of like when I became an adult. And 8 days after I turned 21, 9/11 happened. And as the student body president of my university, I got to figure out how to lead grief with a whole kind of group of things. And then I got to become a pastor where I'm leading grief. I'm in a stage of grief right now, and grief. And we are grieving. We're grieving that the planet is suffering. We're grieving that we don't get to have everything that we thought we had. Grief sucks. But grief is just a form of love. And so, like, in the midst of all of this, I see young people who love it, and I believe that somehow or another they will actually do better than we have done, because they look at what we have done and know that it doesn't work. And they will eventually become the leaders, and we won't be. Like, what will happen, but they will do their best, and they will find a different world than we have found, and they will learn to lead it. And it will be hard, it will be a struggle, but whatever is worth doing won't be accomplished in their lifetime either, because it's never been accomplished. Much like being in Denver, like, do I have, like, no, we have to. Or even like in Tolkien's, like, Lord of the Rings, when, like, asking Gandalf, Bilbo's like, why do I have to do this? And like, well, so does everyone ask who has to leave in these times. But yes, much like Mordecai saying to Esther, you are here for a time such as this. We are here for a time such as this. God knew we were going to be the ones, and I've never felt adequate for it ever. And yet God keeps saying to me something like Jeremiah, before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. And I'm like, well, you should have chosen someone better. But here you are.
We're down to our last minute. Eugenia, it was
I think the whole allowing thing gives me a rash, because we sometimes say that God allowed something that we insisted upon that had nothing to do with God. And so that whole thing kind of, it just gives me a rash. And I think I was so struck by what Garrett was saying about 9/11, and this will be my last word. I remember about a month after 9/11, my mom and I went to New York. We were scared to go. We didn't know what was what, but we always went, and it was a theater trip, and we wanted to support the arts there and the city there. And I had decided I wasn't going to go to Ground Zero, but I couldn't stop myself. And I went down there, and I saw that massive crater in the earth that was still smoldering, and all the sawhorses around it where people had written messages from all over the world. And they were still in recovery then. And I peeked between there, and I saw the recovery dogs with their little booties on, and the people in their hazmat suits down there. And I had a mystical experience. And what I saw in that rubble was Jesus walking over the chaos of human life with a dog and a guy in a hazmat suit, and saying nothing is wasted, nothing is lost forever. Like picking up the fragments from the loaves and fishes, nothing is ever wasted. Nothing is lost forever, and I'm with you in the rubble.
That is a beautiful place to leave this. It's very poignant. The word is alive, and it is indeed alive in our hearts. And we thank you for coming in and listening and sharing this conversation today. Garrett, thank you. Wink, I appreciate your work. Eugenia, it is wonderful to have you here. There is more to talk about, and we will continue our conversation in a later podcast. Safe Harbor Conversations. God bless.